How many of you have ever been to the city of Bethlehem? Anyone? All right. So the modern Palestinian city of Bethlehem is a living memorial to the birth narrative of Jesus. Central to its economic existence in the town is the Church of the Nativity, which is at the center of Manger Square, and Shepherd's Field. So for the tourist that wanders into Bethlehem alone, which is a rare experience these days, a wall of eager tour guides will stand desperate to explain the importance and meaning of each beloved shrine in exchange for a few shekels. Now, there's another important shrine in Bethlehem that tourists might not know about, and that is Rachel's tomb. Now, Rachel was not a living relative of Jesus at the time of his birth, but her story and her tears are invoked in his birth narrative. So let's talk about Rachel for a bit. Does anyone remember from the Old Testament who Rachel is? If you know anything about Rachel, just shout it out. Joseph's mom, that's right. What else? Jacob's wife, the second wife. Yep. Anything else? Okay, good. Well, you're further ahead than most Christians are. Most people do not know their Bible, so congratulations, gold star for all of you. But Rachel's story is a part of the beginning of the people of Israel, and we can find her story in the book of Genesis. So Rachel is the second wife of Jacob, who was the son of Isaac and Rebekah and the grandson of Abraham and Sarah. So Rachel married into the equivalent of a royal family, the family that was promised by God that their descendants would be great people, God's people. So if you recall the story of Jacob and Rachel, you might remember that Jacob was a twin who was at odds with his brother Esau. Jacob and Esau had to go their separate ways, but they reconciled later in life. And then Jacob decided to move his entire family, so 2 wives, 13 children, and a flock of thousands from the north down to the south, to the city of Hebron, where Abraham and Sarah were visited by strangers and promised to be God's chosen people. But the trip did not go as smoothly as everyone hoped. Rachel became pregnant on this trip, and she died on the way to her husband's ancestral home while giving birth. She died in Bethlehem, giving birth to Benjamin. Jacob had to bury Rachel in Bethlehem, and there he built a memorial to her at the site of her death. Rachel's descendants went on to produce powerful leaders like Joshua, Samuel, Saul, and King David. And these leaders would help to build the ancient nation of Israel, and they made names for themselves as powerful leaders. And these men were part of the lineage that brought us Jesus. Now, while it seems like maybe Rachel's not an important character in the story because she's not really centered in the book of Genesis, but her name and her memory are invoked when hundreds of years after the beginning of this ancient nation of Israel, the people, the chosen ones of God, are on their way to occupation under Babylonian rule. So Jeremiah, if you remember, was a teenager, a young prophet from the tribe of Benjamin, and he invoked his ancestral grandmother Rachel, saying, "The Lord proclaims, a voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and wailing." It's Rachel crying for her children. She refuses to be consoled because her children are no more. After exile, God would bring the people back to their land because it seems that Rachel has intervened. God heard her tears, her weeping for her children and for her children's children, and responded. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai notes that the story of the deliverance of God's people depends on Rachel and her tears and her intervention. The Jewish tradition believes that God rescued God's people only because Rachel rose up, weeping for her children, refusing consolation until there's a deliverance for her descendants. And again, Rachel's tears are referenced hundreds of years after this in the town of Bethlehem where Rachel was buried. In Jesus' birth narrative, when Herod realized that the wise ones had slipped out of the region without telling him where Jesus was, he ordered all male children under the age of 2 to be killed. Mary, Joseph, and Jesus managed to escape, but there were many infant boys who did not. Rachel's tears were invoked as a prayer to God for their salvation and rescue. Rachel's life, death, and tears continue to resonate on the land in Bethlehem today. Her shrine is located in Bethlehem and has been noted in historic records for over 1,000 years. Rachel's story has become embedded into the story of Bethlehem and its modern residents, no matter what their religion. Local women over the centuries would come to the tomb to pray for fertility, knowing that Rachel would surely understand their desire for children, given her history of infertility. A tradition of women leaving their names on the walls of the shrine in chalk evolved over the years, which was this informal graffiti-style record of their presence at the tomb of their spiritual ancestor, a mark of their deep connection to Rachel. At the end of the 20th century, the tomb, located in Palestinian territory, was annexed into Israeli territory, given the modern state of Israel's control of the holy site. So Israelis built a wall a half a mile into the city of Bethlehem around Rachel's tomb, taking over buildings near the tomb and building a Jewish school and settlement near Rachel's resting place, all to bar access to the tomb for Palestinians who had guarded and protected this shrine for centuries. Now, the wall that comes through the city is about 2 stories high, and it's what has separated Rachel's resting place from the Palestinian community for the last 25 years. A military watchtower is erected on the wall above the tomb so that if you're a soldier in the watchtower, you can look on one side into Rachel's tomb and the other side into the Palestinian community. And from this watchtower, soldiers throw tear gas onto the Palestinian side of the wall. They spray rubber bullets into crowds of protesters, and they even shower children in summer camps nearby with skunk water, which is as horrible as it sounds. Last year I was in Bethlehem, the city of Jesus' birth and of Rachel's death, and I wanted to see this memorial to Rachel. I wanted to visit her tomb to better understand her tears and to better understand the ways that invoking them in Jesus' birth narrative makes sense. Her shrine is on Hebron Road at a busy intersection in town. I had a friend drop me off there because hoping against hope, I thought maybe I can figure out how to get to the shrine from here. But the grave of Rachel is on the other side of this huge wall, and there's no way to get into it. I would have to walk next to the wall for about a mile to get to the checkpoint and to the other side. So I headed to the checkpoint, following the separation wall as it snaked through the city, and the wall was covered with evocative resistance art. The art memorialized folks like Shireen Abu Akleh, the beloved Christian Palestinian American journalist who was killed by the Israeli military in 2023. It featured the famous cartoon called the Handala, a child who faces away from the viewer, arms behind him, refusing to turn away until Palestine is free. The wall also features poetry and quotes crying out for liberation, things like, "To exist is to resist." It felt somehow important and connected that these pieces of graffiti were on their way to this memorial to the lost. These pieces of graffiti felt to me like they represented Rachel's tears and grief for her descendants. When I finally arrived at the checkpoint, I was met by a helpful taxi driver who informed me that the checkpoint was closed. He saw the shock and the heartbreak in my eyes and spoke to me compassionately. He said, "Since October 7th, 2023, the checkpoint was closed for many months. No one could get in or out. And now the checkpoint is open at 6 a.m., and then it closes at noon or maybe 1 o'clock or whenever the soldiers feel like closing it. So I could not get to Rachel's tomb. The gates were closed. I felt that as a deep loss to my own spiritual story, my own connection to the ancestors of Jesus, whose example we try to follow in our lives. This main checkpoint between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, this crossing between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, where the checkpoint has been imposed, is on the same road that Jacob and his family would have walked as Rachel labored before she gave birth to Benjamin. It's the same road that Mary and Joseph likely walked as Mary began her labor for Jesus' birth, while Joseph frantically looked for a place for them to rest. It's the road that many of our own spiritual ancestors walked as they traveled from slavery in Egypt and into the Promised Land. Where our spiritual ancestors walked, this giant barrier has been constructed, separating people from their land and trying to cut people off from their own stories. If in 2025 Rachel labored on the way to Hebron, she would have delivered Benjamin at the checkpoint and died there, as countless Palestinian women have already done. If Mary labored on the way to Bethlehem in 2025, she would never have made it to the place we now know as Manger Square, where many believe that Mary gave birth to Jesus. If we believe the prophet Jeremiah, who said that their ancestor Rachel wept for them, then surely Rachel is weeping over what has happened in Palestine. Rachel has a tender heart, even after all that she's seen over the centuries. Rachel's heart is tender towards the children of Palestine who have never seen the sea, who cannot move freely, who cannot learn well because of fear of soldiers invading their schools. Rachel wept thousands of years ago for her miscarried children, for her children that she would never be able to hold and parent. She wept for her descendants who were enslaved and who struggled for liberation. She weeps now for the children in Gaza and the West Bank, and she weeps for the losses we experience in our own communities here. Embedded in this Christmas story is an invitation for us to remember our own family stories and our own history. It's an invitation to recall the difficult times that our families have had in the past. So when I think about the difficult things my children face in the future, I remember that my Quaker and Mennonite ancestors came to this country to escape their own potential death for believing that Jesus was the way of peace. I'm sure as my great-great-grandparents crossed the Atlantic Ocean, they wept for what was lost, even as I looked to the future of what might be for themselves, and maybe even for me hundreds of years later. As we move into the future, our ancestors, living and dead, are there to instruct us and guide us. Sometimes they instruct us with things that we should do, and maybe they instruct us with things that we should not do. Their stories are there to remind you that they face some really hard times and that we will be okay. They weep for you and celebrate with you even as you move into the future. Maybe this Christmas season, as you gather around the table with family, this is your opportunity to ask questions of your living ancestors. How might their stories, which are already embedded in your DNA, instruct you as you move forward? Can you ask them about those that came before your own living ancestors and learn from those stories too? Mary and Joseph escaped the city of Bethlehem with Jesus. I know they were scared and maybe a little hopeful, but definitely anxious. And Rachel, their ancestor, who gave birth in Bethlehem too and who died there, held that grief that they felt as Mary and Joseph made their way off to Egypt in the middle of the night. She wept for those who could not escape the horrors of that political moment when a ruler was so scared of the potential of a child that they ordered all children under the age of 2 to be killed. Rachel's story is a story inside of a story in this Christmas season. And these stories give us hope as we look into the future and as we look at the Jesus story and all the ways that this fragile life survived. I pray today that your Christmas holiday be an opportunity for you to hear stories of your past and use them to give you inspiration and courage as you move into the future. Amen.